In this episode, I'm going to help you build a calm, reliable way to recognize the most important acronyms you will hear and see around certified in the governance of enterprise IT, CGEIT, especially the ones tied to domains and task language. Acronyms can feel like a wall for brand new learners, not because the ideas are impossible, but because the letters arrive faster than your brain can translate them under pressure. When that happens, you may understand the concept, but still miss the point of a question because you hesitate on the vocabulary. The goal here is not to flood you with a memorized alphabet soup, but to make the acronyms feel like familiar labels you can hold lightly, so you can focus on governance logic and best answers. As we go, I'll also connect each acronym to what it signals in decision-making, because acronyms matter most when they steer your interpretation of what a question is really testing. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. The first acronym to anchor is the issuer itself, because it tells you what kind of exam mindset you are stepping into and why the language sounds the way it does. ISACA, ISACA, is the organization behind the credential, and it is known for exams that reward governance reasoning, enterprise alignment, and decision frameworks more than tool-level technical detail. That matters because acronyms in this space often represent management disciplines, oversight structures, and lifecycle practices, not product features. When you hear a question use a management acronym, your brain should shift toward leadership intent, accountability, and measurable outcomes, instead of shifting toward implementation steps. That single habit prevents many wrong answers, especially when options tempt you with tactical activity that feels useful but is not the best governance move. It also helps you stay oriented when an acronym appears that you have seen in other contexts, because the exam's meaning is anchored in enterprise governance, not in vendor-specific technology. Think of ISACA language as a signal that the exam expects consistent governance mechanisms and enterprise-wide comparability. A major recurring acronym across governance questions is Enterprise Risk Management, ERM, and the reason it shows up so often is that it represents the enterprise's shared risk conversation. ERM is not simply a security program, and it is not an audit checklist. It is the way leadership compares risks across finance, operations, compliance, reputation, and technology using shared impact language. When a question mentions alignment to ERM, your brain should translate that into integrate, standardize, and make technology risks comparable to other enterprise risks. That typically points you toward answers that establish common taxonomy, consistent reporting, clear decision rights, and escalations that match leadership appetite and tolerance. If you see ERM and an answer option that keeps risk decisions isolated inside one technology team, that isolation usually conflicts with what ERM implies. ERM language is a reminder that governance is about enterprise coherence, not local optimization. It also signals that risk decisions should be explainable in business terms, such as customer impact and operational disruption, not only in technical severity terms. Another acronym that appears constantly is Information Technology, IT, and you may wonder why an exam would emphasize something that seems obvious. In governance language, IT is not just a department. It is the set of services, platforms, data flows, and enabling capabilities that support enterprise objectives. When you hear IT in a governance task, the question is rarely asking what the technology does, and it is more often asking how the enterprise ensures that technology decisions support strategy, deliver value, and stay within risk boundaries. That means you should listen for whether the prompt is really about investment governance, service performance management, benefits realization, or risk oversight. IT also appears alongside information risk, which includes confidentiality, integrity, and availability concerns that shape trust and compliance. When you hear IT, you should assume there are multiple stakeholders involved, including business owners, service owners, risk owners, and governance bodies that manage trade-offs. That assumption nudges you toward answers that clarify ownership, define standards, monitor adherence, and measure outcomes, because those are the levers governance uses to steer IT at enterprise scale. Acronyms related to performance and value management often point you toward the investment governance mindset, where leaders want measurable outcomes rather than delivered activities. One of the most common conceptual pairs you will hear is Key Performance Indicator, KPI, and Key Risk Indicator, KRI. And the difference matters because governance questions can mix performance and risk in ways that confuse beginners. A KPI is a measure of performance against a goal, such as reliability, cycle time, customer satisfaction, or cost efficiency. A KRI is a measure that signals risk exposure, such as increasing exception counts, declining control adherence, rising incident severity, or growing dependency concentration. When a prompt asks you to establish performance management, think KPI-style outcomes and consistent measurement across investments, processes, and services. When a prompt asks you to monitor exposure to risk policies and standards, think KRI-style early warning signals that trigger escalation and corrective action. The exam often rewards answers that use both kinds of measures in a disciplined way, because performance without risk awareness can drive reckless behavior, and risk monitoring without performance goals can become fear-driven avoidance. Another cluster of acronyms that frequently appear in enterprise governance settings relate to security oversight and operational assurance, and they tend to be used as role labels rather than as technical mechanisms. Chief Information Security Officer, CISO, is one you will see often, and the key for the exam is not the job description details, but what the role represents in governance decision-making. CISO signals accountability for security direction, control strategy, and communication of security risk in business terms, often in partnership with enterprise risk leadership. When a question implies that security priorities must be aligned to enterprise priorities, CISO is frequently part of the stakeholder picture, but the best answer usually emphasizes governance mechanisms rather than relying on a single role to fix everything. You may also see Chief Risk Officer, CRO, which signals enterprise-wide risk oversight, including alignment to and consistent risk reporting. When CISO and CRO appear together in your mind, the governance logic often points toward integration, shared language, and decision rights that reflect enterprise appetite and tolerance. You will also see acronyms tied to oversight structures and governance rhythm, and these acronyms can shape what kind of answer is most appropriate. A steering committee, SC, is a typical label for a decision body that prioritizes investments, resolves trade-offs, and maintains alignment to enterprise objectives. Even if the exam does not always spell it out, the idea of an SC appears in questions about portfolio management, benefit realization oversight, and enterprise-wide standards enforcement. When your brain recognizes an SC concept, you should think about decision cadence, accountability for outcomes, and consistent reporting that supports decisions rather than status theater. Another common oversight acronym is Service Level Agreement, SLA, which signals measurable expectations for service performance that can be monitored and enforced. If a question is about governing services end-to-end, SLA language hints that you should look for answers that establish performance targets, monitor trends, and tie deviations to escalation and improvement actions. Because this credential is governance-focused, you will hear many acronyms associated with control and assurance, and the exam expects you to understand them as enterprise mechanisms rather than technical checklists. Governance, risk, and compliance, GRC, is a common umbrella term, and it signals the coordination of policy, standards, risk assessment, monitoring, and evidence needed for oversight. When GRC appears, your instinct should be that the enterprise wants consistency, traceability, and accountability, not a scattered set of team-specific practices. Internal audit, IA, is another acronym that can appear, and it represents independent assurance that controls are designed and operating effectively. The key exam habit is to avoid treating IA as an enemy or as a punishment system, because governance logic treats audit as a feedback mechanism that identifies gaps and drives improvement initiatives based on results. If you see an option that hides issues from IA or treats audit findings as something to work around, that usually conflicts with governance credibility. In contrast, options that formalize exception handling, track remediation, and report progress transparently tend to align with how governance expects IA interactions to work. Data-related acronyms show up more and more because governance increasingly must handle analytics and AI needs without losing control. Artificial intelligence, AI, is often used in prompts that are really about data governance, purpose limitation, and accountability for how data is used and retained. When you hear AI, do not assume the question is asking about model design, because the exam focus is typically on governance boundaries, risk evaluation, and measurable oversight of outcomes and exposure. You may also encounter data loss prevention, DLP, which signals controls that reduce the risk of sensitive data leaving approved boundaries. The governance angle is not about how DLP works technically, but about how policies and standards define what must be protected, how adherence is monitored, and how exceptions are handled without undermining credibility. If a question includes AI and DLP signals in the background, the best answers often emphasize classification, access governance, monitoring, retention discipline, and ethical use oversight, because those are the enterprise mechanisms that keep innovation sustainable. You will also encounter continuity and resilience acronyms that matter because governance treats reliability as part of risk, not as a separate operational concern. Business continuity planning, BCP, signals the enterprise's plan to sustain critical operations during disruption, while disaster recovery, DR, signals the ability to restore technology services after failure. These acronyms can appear directly or indirectly through language about recovery time objectives and sustained service delivery. The exam often rewards answers that treat BCP and DR as governance commitments that require ownership, testing discipline, and measurable readiness, not as documents written once and forgotten. When you see resilience acronyms, remember that the governance move is to ensure capability level priorities are defined, service level performance is monitored, and recovery expectations are enforced consistently. The acronym itself is less important than what it implies about lifecycle thinking and continuous oversight. Acronyms tied to policy and standards enforcement often appear as indicators of how mature the governance environment is, and they can help you interpret what a question is pointing toward. Policy, standard, and procedure, PSP, is a phrase you may hear informally, and the governance point is that policies express direction, standards express enforceable requirements, and procedures express how work is performed consistently. If a prompt highlights inconsistent behavior or repeated deviations, the correct logic often involves tightening standards, clarifying procedures, and monitoring adherence with clear exception handling. Another acronym that may appear in related contexts is Risk Appetite Statement, RAS, which signals leadership's declared boundaries for acceptable exposure. When a question hints that teams are guessing, making inconsistent decisions, or arguing about what is allowed, RAS thinking pushes you toward answers that define appetite and tolerance, and then enforce them through consistent decision rights and reporting. That consistency is what makes policy real, and it is why the exam treats governance credibility as a recurring theme. One of the most helpful ways to use acronyms on exam day is to treat them as signposts that tell you which governance lens to apply, rather than treating them as facts you must recite. If you see ERM, your lens is enterprise alignment and comparable risk reporting. If you see KPI and KRI patterns, your lens is measurable performance management and early warning signals that trigger action. If you see GRC or IA implications, your lens is consistent standards, evidence, and credible exception handling. If you see BCP or DR ideas, your lens is resilience as a governed capability with measurable readiness. If you see AI, your lens is data governance, purpose, and ethical, controlled use that protects trust. This signpost approach matters because it reduces cognitive load, which is the biggest challenge during an exam. When your brain knows which lens to use, it becomes easier to choose the best answer because you are comparing options within the correct governance frame instead of drifting into tool thinking. It is also important to understand that some acronyms can mislead you because they are familiar from other exams or workplaces, and you may import the wrong meaning. For example, you might think of an SLA as a contract clause you negotiate once, but governance thinking treats it as a measurable commitment that must be monitored and managed over time. You might think of GRC as software, but governance thinking treats it as an integrated discipline of policy, risk, and compliance practices. You might think of DR as a backup activity, but governance thinking treats it as a capability that requires testing, ownership, and measurable recovery outcomes. This exam rewards the governance meaning of acronyms, which is usually about repeatable mechanisms, accountability, and evidence. When you catch yourself drifting into a purely technical interpretation, pause and reframe the acronym as an enterprise decision signal. That single adjustment often flips a borderline question into a clear best answer choice. To keep this high yield in your mind, it helps to mentally associate each major acronym with a one-sentence governance intent that you can recall under pressure. CGEIT should remind you that the exam is about enterprise governance decisions and outcomes, not about configuration. ERM should remind you that risk must be integrated, comparable, and aligned to leadership boundaries. IT should remind you that technology is an enabling system tied to enterprise objectives, requiring ownership and measurable performance. KPI and KRI should remind you that you manage what you measure, and that measurement should drive action, not politics. CISO and CRO should remind you that roles matter, but governance mechanisms matter more than relying on individuals. GRC and IA should remind you that consistency, evidence, and transparency build credibility. BCP and DR should remind you that resilience is a governed capability with measurable readiness. AI and DLP should remind you that analytics and innovation must be enabled through controlled data governance rather than unmanaged sprawl. As we wrap up, the real purpose of an acronym reference like this is to keep your attention on governance logic instead of letting unfamiliar letters steal your time and confidence. Acronyms on this exam are mostly signals for the domain you are in and the kind of decision the question is testing, such as enterprise alignment, risk optimization, performance management, standards enforcement, or resilience readiness. When you recognize the acronym and immediately translate it into its governance intent, you reduce cognitive load and you make your reasoning more consistent across questions. That consistency is what earns points, because the exam is designed to reward defensible decision-making that fits enterprise objectives, accountability, and evidence-based control. If you remember one guiding idea, let it be that acronyms are not the destination. They are signposts, and when you treat them as signposts, you stay calm, you read questions more accurately, and you choose the best governance answer more reliably.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.